this is Paul Pachter, CEO of Long Island Cares, the Harry Chapin Food Bank, and welcome back to another episode of Breaking Bread from Long Island Cares. This is our show right here on YouTube where we talk about everything and anything, but it has something to do most of the time with hunger and food insecurity, but perhaps not today, because my guest is a friend of mine and a dear colleague who I have great respect for, and that's Dr. Jeffrey Reynolds, who is the CEO and president of Family Service Association of Long Island. They are clearly an historic organization. They were founded in the late 1800s. I don't know many nonprofits on the island that are over 100 years old. Jeff, thanks so much for doing the show and welcome.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Great to see you. So let's begin. 1886?
1884.
1884.
Yeah.
An organization is founded here on Long Island when it was probably still potato farms.
Yes.
And it has lasted for like over 100 years. So let's talk about Family and Children's Association, what you do, and would you agree with my analysis that you've got an historic organization going?
Yeah, and I think that history put a special emphasis on COVID for us because I was reminded by some of our board members, some of our staff, some of our donors, that this was not our first pandemic. And
right.
Don't screw it up. And so from the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919 through a couple world wars, through the recession, through Sandy, through 9/11, FCA has managed to persevere. And I'm really proud of the way we came through the pandemic. It's still not over for a lot of the folks we serve, as it isn't for yours. But it was really our staff that rose up. And in leading the organization, I guess I feel like my imperative is I've been given the privilege of running a really storied organization for a set period of time, and I'm going to do the best I can with it and then lovingly hand it off to somebody else for the next chapter. But that creates a real sense of responsibility.
Sure it does. And you offer a lot of services for many, many people, a diverse group of people. What's Family and Children's up to right now? Where are your big focuses if you had to pick three?
Yeah, so that's actually pretty easy for us to do, although I'll maybe make it four, because two are connected.
Okay.
Out of COVID, and none of these conditions came about as a result of COVID, but they're all worsened by COVID, the same way hunger existed pre-COVID, and now for some folks it's a deeper dynamic in their lives. Addiction treatment and recovery continues to be a big issue given the rate of overdoses here on Long Island that exceeds that they were even seeing in the 5 boroughs. We saw an increase in drug and alcohol use during COVID, and that's manifested itself in some lost gains when it came to the prevention work, the access to treatment work that we did pre-COVID, and the support for people in recovery. So I'm pretty proud of the fact that we've opened 3 recovery centers in the past 5 years, whereas before we didn't have any here on Long Island. Second area, and it's related, and this is a connection, is in kids' mental health. We run a kids' mental health program that serves about 400 kids per month. I've been in this field for a long time, and I've never seen it this bad in terms of attempted suicides, completed suicides, school refusal. Its families are really struggling at this point in time. The uptick in gun violence has been very significant here on Long Island and elsewhere, and while elected officials can quibble over bail reform, we've got a street-based intervention that is led by credible messengers, folks who have some experience in the communities we serve, like Hempstead, who are out there working to lessen the likelihood of retaliatory gun violence. And then the last issue, and I know it's a population you guys serve as well, is seniors.
Right.
And seniors were vulnerable, at risk, disadvantaged before COVID. I think COVID, again, we can argue about who's to fault for the nursing home debacle in New York State, but there's a lot of seniors who watched their spouses die in nursing homes via FaceTime, whose families haven't been able to afford it here and have moved on to other places that might seem more affordable, and who are dealing with depression, anxiety, a lack of access to care, and all the things that were there before, but I think now have been worsened. So those are just some of our focuses, I think. Historically, we have emphasized those issues, but also worked hard in communities that have been neglected for a long time. And I'm thinking of, at Nassau, Hempstead, Freeport, Uniondale, Roosevelt, In Suffolk, it's a little bit more diverse, but it's CI, Bayshore, Brentwood, Amityville, Coram, Gordon Heights, Riverhead. All communities that require organizations like ours pulling together and trying to make a difference.
And all the investment that organizations like yours and ours now are making in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we're looking at communities, as you say, which are populated mostly by people of color. We know that the fastest growing population group on Long Island are people from South America, Central America. It's estimated that by 2025, they will represent about 52% of the population. But let's unpack this one by one if we can, focusing in on substance abuse, the abuse of prescription drugs, party drugs for young people, the fentanyl epidemic that's affecting probably every single state. You know, it's always been my impression that Long Island or Long Islanders can't wrap their hands around problems that they feel shouldn't exist in suburbia. Oh, fentanyl crisis, no, that in the Bronx maybe. Prescription drugs, no, that's going on in the city, the people who live in Manhattan. No, these problems are going on in Long Island and not just in communities of color. You know, the medicine chest has become one of the more popular dealers for young people to at least begin the spiral into drug abuse. It starts with prescription drugs in many cases. What are you seeing and what concerns you now after doing this for so many years? And here we are in 2022. If you were sitting down with both county executives, what would you tell them? Guys, you need to open up your eyes because we have a major problem here.
Yeah, I think the challenge in suburbia is we do cast most of our problems off as being things that somehow can't make it through the Midtown Tunnel, and there's a notion that our white picket fences are going to protect us. And in the case of heroin, that gave heroin a 10-year running head start on our kids. And then we tried to catch up with a half-hearted effort, and then almost as soon as we acknowledged it was a problem, we forgot about it. And here we are, where we've gone from prescription drugs to heroin to fentanyl. And tomorrow it will be something else. And I think that would be my main message to the county executives, and that we have to stop chasing the drug du jour, and we have to get to the core of this. The core of this are adolescents who suffer from anxiety and depression and don't have good access to mental health care, schools that don't have the proper training or interventions to pick up these things early on in the game. Treatment on demand is reality for some people, but not for everybody, particularly if you're female, particularly if you are pregnant or parenting female, or a young woman with an eating disorder. You know, treatment remains elusive for a lot of folks because of the insurance practices that have gone unchecked. And then we have to do a much better job of supporting people in recovery. I've been to 1,000,001 quote-unquote graduations from drug treatment facilities, and there's really no other medical condition that's chronic in nature for which you graduate and get a pat on the back and go home. And you know, with most medical conditions, we understand that there's a step-down process, and we know that for young people that use drugs for 5, 6, 7 years during those formative times, that we've got to rebuild that social and emotional learning. So taking drugs out of their life is real important, but the big question is, what are we going to help them put it back in? And our first response to substance use disorders is always criminal justice. And a criminal justice response to a public health problem leaves us nowhere. It hasn't worked since Nixon declared war on drugs in 1971. So I would say to both county executives, and I have, honestly, we've got to get to some of these core issues. We've got to make sure that we're working in concert with law enforcement, but not relying on law enforcement to deal with what amounts to a brain disease.
It's interesting because what you're saying, and I'm hearing, can hold true in mental health as well. You can't criminalize the treatment. You know, and I understand there are drug courts, and I understand that there are individuals who could be remanded to attend a program at Family and Children's Association. But you really have to look at the problem. Number one, the root causes of it. What have we ignored for the past decade or more with a family member? I would imagine it might have gotten a little better by 2022, but are there families still in denial about their own children having drug abuse problems?
There are, and I think there's no good training programs to teach parents how to recognize the signs and symptoms of a mental health disorder or a substance use disorder, and there's always the notion that it's just a phase. right? Most of people our age kind of did our thing back in the day. The world didn't stop spinning on its axis. We're productive adults. Everything was okay.
Yeah.
And for most kids, that's the case. For the 10 to 20%, though, that suffer from more serious conditions or wind up with a substance use disorder, it's not going to be okay without some intervention.
Right.
So I think parents are always reluctant to acknowledge there's a problem. They don't open up to schools. It's hard to get psychiatric care when you need it. And the biggest beef I have with parents, and I talk about this in school districts that have high net worth families, is sometimes the behavior you model isn't the best. If you need to pop a Xanax and have a glass of wine before you get on a plane, you've now sent a message to your kid that the way you deal with anxiety and stress is to use a drink and a drug. If you come home from work and say, what a week, and immediately pop open vodka that's stored next to popsicles in the freezer, you sent a message. And I've said to parents, what you say is important, but what you do is actually more important.
And what do you think? I mean, also I'm thinking about younger people today having access to so much media. And it's not just social media, the Facebook and the TikTok, and I know that they all do their things on those platforms. For the last few weeks, I've been binging on high school dramas from other countries on Netflix. The one I'm watching right now is called Control Z. And I thought of you when I was watching it because everything is being laid to bear in these programs. The club drugs when you go out, clubbing on the weekend, the access to the alcohol, the fact that a lot of kids are living in homes with rich families, like in Mexico and Spain, and the families are traveling for business and the kids are left to their own devices. And the peer pressure that kids are going through, 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, can be overwhelming. And if a parent is absent, when this is going on, there's not much they're really going to be able to do until they get a knock on the door from someone in law enforcement saying, we busted your son or we busted your daughter. Oh, it's nothing. What they do? They went to the medicine chest. They took one of my pills. No, they're actually selling these pills at their school. Where do we as a society, when it comes to substance abuse, especially drug abuse, and you've mentioned all the stuff, the war on drugs, the just say no, none of it's worked. I read these days there's more money available right now for drug and alcohol treatment, and I hope that your organization is getting some of it. You also mentioned earlier about the community, recovery programs like Thrive that you've opened up. So it's a two-point question. What do you say as a society we need to do, as a region we have to do? And then let's talk about the importance of the recovery programs.
So look, and when it comes to prevention, I think there's no guidebook for being a good parent. And I think, even everyday regular parenting is challenging in and of itself for the most well-adjusted and educated parent. It gets even more challenging when you have a kid that has some issues. I think now the threats are greater than they've ever been. I just think about the potency level of marijuana that's available these days. When I was growing up, certainly fentanyl was not a thing. No. Heroin was a thing that was limited to certain communities. You had kids that obviously smoked too much weed and didn't show up for class, but that was basically it. Now we're at a point in time where a kid takes a pill at a party that could be laced with fentanyl, and they can be blue and shaking 3 minutes later. And so I think the game has changed, but I don't necessarily know that parents understand how much the game has changed. And usually when they find out, there too is a lead time while they're stuck in denial or off doing their thing instead of going to the school programs. I also think as educators, we made a lot of mistakes in that we've really, in some cases, not been very thorough in our prevention education messages. We said, just say no, you're going to ruin your brain, you're going to wind up incarcerated, you'll be homeless living in a box, and your world will come to an end. And if you drink a beer under the age of 15, you're going to be shooting heroin tomorrow. That's not the way it works for most kids. And if we took the time to have a more thoughtful conversation about the impact of drugs and alcohol, specifically on the developing brain, and took more than a 40-minute class session to explain all of this, I think we'd have an easier time with kids. They wouldn't think we're lying to them. They wouldn't think we're exaggerating. When we go into districts now, it's very often you have 45 minutes, scare the heck out of them and hope for the best. Or we send cops into classrooms and say, if you deal drugs, I'm going to catch you and I'm going to lock you up. drug abuse doesn't work in that way. It's a
Doesn't
very
work.
complex behavior.
Doesn't work with the scared straight model.
Right,
That's
right.
that may be good for incarceration and the criminal justice system, but not when we're dealing with community treatment for drugs.
Doesn't.
We have absolutely ran out of time for this episode. Stay here because we want you to come back and do another episode with us.
Let's do it.
And we'll talk about mental health. There's so much that you've unraveled for me. Jeff Reynolds is the president and CEO of Family and Children's Association right here on Long Island, one of the experts in the field of substance abuse, drug abuse, and mental illness. And we're going to bring him back and we're going to talk a little bit more about the issue. You've been watching Breaking Bread from Long Island Cares. I'm Paule Pachter, the CEO of Long Island Cares. I want to thank CardWorks for all the support they provide us. If you have any financial or accounting needs, visit CardWorks online at cardworks.com, where they treat you really like a great customer. So until we see you next time, continue to take care of each other. Stay well. See you next time.